Well, greetings, Marc Neikrug. Where do I find you?
In Santa Fe, New Mexico.
And which is where you live, obviously. So, what keeps you busy in Santa Fe?
Well, several things. Uh, I have a world-class chamber music festival every summer with about 100 musicians who come from all over, and we put on about 40 to 45 concerts. Uh, I also am a composer, obviously, so I spend time composing. And I'm also, let's call it the patriarch of a large family. I have 5 grandchildren, 2 great-grandsons, and everyone is within 40 minutes.
Let me focus on your work as a composer. Um, what's it like to be a composer as opposed to a performer? What's the difference?
Um, Apples, oranges, uh, even more so.
Mhm.
Uh, I've done both, for many, many, actually 4 decades. I traipsed around the world being a performer, uh, while also composing, and, it's a completely different existence. Performing has an immediacy to it. You go on the stage, there are thousands of people in an audience. You play for them, and they applaud you if you're good, and there's a kind of immediate reaction to the work that you're doing.
Mhm.
A composer, on the other hand, sits at home in his beautiful house in Santa Fe and works in complete isolation, uh, all, let's say, to one extent or another, imaginary. I don't have an orchestra at home. I don't have the musicians or the singers or the actors that are going to play the piece I'm writing.
Mhm.
And so it's completely uh, a self-contained, isolated endeavor to create something which you may or may not hear within a year or 5 years or whenever. But the satisfaction and the fulfillment is completely different
Mhm.
because you're making something which actually has a tangible existence beyond a concert.
It's interesting, as someone who, as part of your introduction of who you are, mentioned that you're a patriarch of a family. I see a connection there between being a patriarch and being a composer.
Of
Uh,
course.
it's just fascinating. So, in some sense, if like what words come to mind now, what I've heard you describe what it's like to be a composer, words like solitude, patience, loneliness, anxiety might all come to mind. Um, so it all goes on in your head, in some sense. Quite literally, I mean, I'm a writer, you're a composer of music. So what goes on in your head is music and song. Is that what you start hearing and thinking?
Uh, it's not an act, or let's say it's not a passive hearing. It takes active energy to make yourself hear,
Hmm.
because hearing without sound, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about
Yeah.
the imagination of sound.
Because you haven't composed it yet. It hasn't been written.
Right. And so therefore, it's all to do with an extremely cultivated auditory memory.
Hmm.
It's my memory of sound, which allows me to force myself to listen, to hear what I'm writing down on the page. Now, obviously, there are accessories like large pianos, which can help. But if you're writing for anything other than that piano, uh, it's the auditory memory of the sound of a violin, the sound of an orchestra, the sound of whatever.
Or to pivot now a bit to song by Mahler, the sound of a clarinet
Correct.
and
String
help me out,
quartet
a string quartet and a clarinet,
and to sing.
which you're not. I don't think you got those in the house there. That you're sort of, oh, let me get the clarinet out and play a little. I'm going to pivot to those instruments in just a minute, but before I do, with a song by Mahler in mind, which is this piece of, Romy, you call it a musical theater. So we have our music, but we also have words, which become song, and we also have a story. So this is probably an overly focused question, but dare I ask, what comes first? Was it the story? Was it a sound? Yes. What's the chicken here? Is it the story, the sound, a bit of both? Something else?
Well, it's all of the above, but I can explain a little bit better.
Yeah.
The concept of nature and nurture in my particular case was both. On my mother's side, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my mother were all musicians. I mean, world-class, excellent musicians. So my father also was a musician. So the genes were there, but both parents being musicians, I was born into, or even before, in the womb. I spent 9 months next to a cello, which is what my mother played. So my first language, unquestionably, was the emotional content of musical sound. And from birth, from embryo to birth, to growing up in the house, to playing, I always readily felt an emotional connection to musical sound. So anything I felt, I also felt as music.
Mm-hmm.
So in the context of writing this particular piece or any other piece that I've written, which is words, theater, and music, it's working on the play first, working on the story, working on the words, working on the context, but always, every minute of that work, in the back of my mind, being extremely cautious and aware of how the music will sound. Not precisely, but generally, what's the feel of this scene? What's the feel of this person saying these words?
With feeling expressed through music,
Correct.
which I think all of us who listen to music get it, but those of us who aren't composers, of which I count myself as one, don't get that. Of course, we don't do that, although maybe we have a tune in our head sometimes.
No,
This is fascinating. So let me probe a bit more, which is working on the play, on the story. So at some point, this play came into your head. Talk about that. How did you arrive at, I want to tell the story of someone with Alzheimer's. It's going to be a woman and she's going to be a singer, and there's going to be a husband and he's her accompanist. Nothing's by accident in your libretto, by the way. I read it and every word counts.
right.
You're not Wagner, you're Neikrug.
Now, the writing of the story, the writing of, who are these characters? What are they going to do? How do I tell this story and where does it go? That takes a long time and a lot of sorting out.
Revision.
Revision, well, even pre-revision,
Okay.
before you even put something down, who is the man and why is he there and how does he fit into this story? And every scene has its own necessity
Mhm.
in order to prepare for the whole thing to make sense and to take you where I want to take you, because it's a journey which has the purpose of uh, having an audience experience this very particular sequence of emotions and sequence of observation.
Mhm.
And that, you know, not being in any case a professional writer, uh, I've I find it a struggle. I don't know if a professional writer also, I believe they also struggle.
That is true.
Yeah, it takes a long time. And much of what gets sorted out in the end uh, can present immense problems.
So, what got you onto the say, I want to tell a story about Alzheimer's, or I want to tell a story about a couple living with it? What moved you to that?
Um, as always, with anything I've ever written, uh, it seems to be circumstantial. Uh, Different things will happen in the course of one's existence, and at some point, these things merge. Uh, in this case, uh, we had a very good friend who had Alzheimer's, and we witnessed the progression. And
Hmm.
she happened to have been a singer when she was young. I mean, she was now old, but she had been a singer. That was in the back of my mind.
Right.
Uh, and then I've spent quite a bit of time in the past years uh, interested in music and the mind and all of the neurophysicists who are doing incredibly interesting work in that field. I actually had some of them here for a symposium once, and I've been fascinated by that. And at some point, these different threads of thought come together, and
Hmm.
I'm sitting there one day, and I think, well, uh, what about a singer who gets Alzheimer's, and how do we present the idea of music as therapy, as a conduit for
Hmm.
trying to keep the brain active? Uh, what better than a husband? And
Hmm.
so once the husband fit in there, then you say, well, maybe he's her accompanist. There you go. And then another thread, I played for 35 years in a row with Pinchas Zuckerman.
Hmm.
At a certain point, we were playing a lot of encores. We would play a recital and people wouldn't go home. So we came up with a little piece that I found that was our finishing encore. Whenever we played that, we wouldn't play anymore.
We're
And
done.
people got used to it. And that became a real vehicle in a song by Mahler, where I used that very effectively, the idea of a finishing piece.
I just have to say, was the piece with Pincus also a song by
No,
Mahler's
no,
love song?
no, no,
Okay, was it right?
completely different.
But you had in your head this idea of um, a piece of music which marks the end of
Correct.
a relationship. In that case, it's the relationship between performers and an audience, which, as we started out our conversation, you told me is a very intimate, intense, emotionally charged event for a performer, at least, and certainly for many in the audience.
Right.
And here, okay, so we've got that concept. So I see how you arrived from personal experience with the friend who had the disease, objective academic interest, if you will, in the neuroscience of music, began to put those together, the connection of, well, she's going to be a singer. And tell me more about what made you say, and I'm going to have a family member, kind of have the caregiver,
Right, right.
and you had a lot of choices. You could have had a daughter, you could have had whatever. You could have not had anyone, although I think it wouldn't have worked without. But anyway, but you picked a husband, a spouse, but then you made him their accompanist. Tell me more about that thinking. Are we back to
Well,
you and Pincus on stage in some sense in the relationship, that kind of.
uh, I never thought of it that way, but that
Mhm.
could, I mean, he needs help. I could help him.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, but
but
the bond that you had and
the
whatnot.
bond becomes multiple because it's
Yeah.
not only the spouse, but it's also the partner, the musical partner,
Hmm.
and the intimacy of that particular piece. And then uh, that specific song becomes the real crux of it because that song is about love and why should we love somebody? What is the pure essence of healthy, loving motivation? Not wealth, not beauty, uh, but love itself. The sense of love, and that became so crucial because in the end, anyone who is a caregiver for a deteriorating and ultimately vanishing person, what motivates? What do you have to hold on to? It's that love.
That's right. That what I would say when I read the libretto, and I've seen the piece now several times, it's it it's about connection
Right.
and the struggle to maintain connection. Because your Mahler's song is, "I love you for your body, I love you for your money, I love you." Well, yeah, those are all good motivators for at least a transient love experience. But if you really want to talk about what is love, it is about ultimately there is some connection
But
between two
also,
people.
yeah, Jason, more importantly, uh, it flips the loving to be about the person doing the loving. In other words, I'm not loving for an aspect of the other person, but it becomes the act of loving itself.
Hmm.
You love for love's sake, and therefore it presents a possibility of hope after, some avenue to maintain your own existence after this tragic event because it's your love that matters.
Which I'm going to make a bold statement. In some sense, what you've stated, as I hear that, is a way to conceptualize what is the act of providing care.
Yeah, also, it's
Yeah.
the act of providing, but it's also defines you as a person. Every person loves differently, and how you love, and this one of the big changes in my life was the becoming a patriarch and understanding what that entails, and that entails uh, loving a great number of people and having the ability, having the strength and the motivation to give that.
Yeah.
And that defines who I am.
Hmm.
Therefore, whether or not the person is alive or is no longer alive, how you love that person and how you maintain that and uh, cherish that loving defines you as a person.
Caregivers often describe an experience to me as a clinician of what I call and what is described in literature, an original term in my part, ambiguous loss. And
Mm,
it has its origins in most classically uh, 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 the individual whose spouse or family is off to sea in the days before
mhm,
communication from ship to shore, who wonders, will they ever come back?
mhm, mhm.
And they may be gone, they may not be gone. Wartime experiences, missing in
Right.
action. And this idea of ambiguous loss, the person's there but not there, is certainly something caregivers struggle with. And you nicely portray that in Mahler. And of course, what caregivers seek is to create that connection to some
Right.
and in an advanced stage disease, they often talk about their perceptions of lucidity in the individual, that sense that
Right,
that
right, right,
person
right.
is connected and communicating. And I think that's one of the strengths of what you captured so nicely there is that experience. And I wondered if you could talk a bit more then about how you see music having a role in that connection, in that creation of connection, more generally the arts, but since your work in areas than music, let's just focus on music.
Well, what I have understood from the neuroscientists that I've experienced is that music, well, we know it's its own language, but that it also uh, reaches the brain through pathways that differs from speech. So that in the treating of aphasia, they found that they can get people to sing where they can't speak.
Mhm.
And so in my sense of it, and particularly with my background, uh, and knowing how musicians feel and how they think, uh, it's a completely distinct mental geography that deals with connecting to music. And so the idea of two professional musicians, one of whom is uh, receding in their mental possibilities, of course, the musician is going to try and keep that conduit to the part of the brain that reacts to music, the part that's separate. And I've seen videos of people, and I have spoken to people who have given me examples of real sequences where, for instance, someone told me about visiting their mother, I believe it was, in an Alzheimer's home, and there
Mhm.
was a man who who had no idea what day it was, had no idea what his name was, didn't know where he was, but he would listen to the Metropolitan Opera broadcasts on the radio, and he could sing entire parts.
Mhm.
So the simultaneity of total absence of memory, but in the musical geography, there's access.
And he was enjoying it.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
and
Um, yeah, and
connecting
connecting. Yeah.
to a real, life experience.
Yeah. Which is what it means to be human.
Right.
Let me pivot a bit, and you've sort of how have people received Mahler as you've taken it on the road and it's been performed? Of course, this performance at the Philadelphia Chamber Music Society here in Philadelphia is not the first. It's been premiered elsewhere, et cetera. So how's it been received?
Well, it's, very effective in the sense that audiences, uh, they don't lose their attention. They are really drawn into it from the beginning to the end, and it has huge impact. Obviously, we know the numbers, and so it's inevitable that X number of people in that audience have some experience or connection. And uh, in many cases, people will focus on one or another of the particular scenes or events that happen because they can relate to that, and not necessarily all of it, but the some experience is really palpable. It's very powerful.
Yeah, yeah. Um, it's one story. I mean, as opposed to the many, everyone has their own story. I'm
Right.
curious. Do you see it bringing how in the discussions that have occurred after the performance of what kind of stories come out? What are some of the comments that people make?
Well, just sort of what you would expect. I remember the same thing with my father or my mother or my aunt or whatever, and It's all the little experience. I do want to say something else, though. The power of music is not only inevitable, but there's no defense against it. You cannot unhear what's going on. And the power of that underlying this story is what really makes the impact. It's, as I said before, it's a different pathway. So while you're listening to the words with that part of your brain that absorbs that kind of experience, subconsciously on a different level, this music is telling a story as well. And the story that the music tells is always more real and more honest than anything you can put into words, because there's no translation. We're not listening to speech and translating into thought. The music is its own direct contact to your emotional being.
This gets back to your childhood experience in the womb. Even it was no mere quip. I think when you said I was born next to a cello or grew up next to a cello, quite literally, my mother played it while I was in her womb. But what I hear, when I think I hear you getting at is back to your remarks about your own childhood and exposure to music, is the ability of music to sort of bypass the complexities of language.
Yes, and I honestly, with no scientific proof and none going to be available to me, I am completely convinced that we react to music biologically, that it's cellular.
Mm-hmm.
Humans from forever have a cellular relationship to the sound of the organized sound of music.
Well, that's very interesting because there is evidence in non-human animals that perception of vibration, we'll just leave it at that. We don't know if they're hearing it. I don't know if what a bat hears, like, do they hear music or do they, but we know that vibratory sensations have animals do all kinds of different behaviors.
Right.
The clarinet,
Hmm.
I have to ask you. So you've got a string quartet. I get that. I mean, that's so great. But then there's this clarinet, and it's a quirky instrument. I'm not a musician, but it's one of those instruments like a saxophone, or there's a couple instruments where it's a little like vodka. Enough is good, but too much is a little too much. I'm not sure. I hope I'm not offending the clarinetists out there, but piano works, cello works, strings work. But clarinet's a tough one. I mean, it demands to be listened to, or otherwise it's. So what made you pick the clarinet? What's up there?
Very particularly, I needed another voice as opposed to the quartet. I needed something which had a very different sound, a distinctive sound, which could blend with the string quartet, but which also could be a kind of a soloist even. And there was a point in writing this piece where I was going to have the clarinetist, actually, I was going to have all of them moving around in the piece,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in the spot where the woman just loses it and steps out of the piece itself and says, "I'm going out into the audience," like that. I had imagined all of them leaving and wandering around the stage, still playing. And I particularly had envisioned that clarinet being one of there's a scene where the protagonist, the male protagonist, speaks about the woman having seen her son.
Or
And
enough.
I had envisioned the clarinet being the son and actually having them converse, the clarinet sound and the woman. I got away from that for many practical reasons. But the clarinet is a kind of third ghost character commenting. You'll find many scene changes where something has come to an end. There will be a clarinet solo, which is basically an emotional, it's me commenting on what you just witnessed, or
Yeah.
making a transition from that to the next thing.
Yeah.
So the clarinet was very important, and of all the wind instruments, it has the largest range. It has many different parts of the range which can sound very differently, and I needed that. So that was the choice there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's very clever. Very clever. Um, it's your chance to sort of tell your listening, viewing audience any other thoughts or reflections on the piece now that it's had a life of its own. In some sense, you back to our beginning remarks, you create something. It's like as a patriarch, it's your child. It comes out. The metaphor might be a little overdone here, but then it kind of grows up and goes out into the world and has a life of its own. How's it been doing?
I'm very happy with it. Usually, I know when I'm done. I I don't often have surprises. The surprises are all before you're done, and the difficulties that have to be overcome. But this one really is so effective. It's loaded with emotional volcanoes, and I think that the timing of them works very well. The end, I'm I'm happy with. I'm slightly ambivalent because I know different people have seen it in different ways. I have my own sense of what it's supposed to be, but people will ask me, "Well, is she dead? Are they both dead? Is he in heaven? What's going on there?" Um, I think it's fine anyway. People want to absorb it, uh, but I think the piece is very effective in the combination of this emotional power of music, together with a story which is in itself very emotional, but it's skeletal. This is not a novel.
Mm-mm.
It's skeletal, and so it really depends on that skeleton having balance. And you know, in music, we are always talking about the elapse of time. We don't know what a piece is until it's over. You have no sense, and then in retrospect, you understand what this was. Uh, but I think it's well balanced. I think the length is good. I'm happy with it. I'm very happy with it. It's a
Yeah, you should
grim
be.
tale. It's a grim tale.
Oh, well, I mean, all disease is awful if something wasn't, or bad at least, or uncomfortable. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be a disease. But there is something uniquely difficult about this disease,
Right.
Alzheimer's. Um, yeah, I think it is a distillation of the entire disease course from its earliest presentation to the very end
Right.
in an hour and change, which
Right. Right. Right.
uh, so you move the viewer very quickly forward. But you're right. I think that's why music works so well here. Had
Yeah.
that been done in a play, I think we would leave it saying this is the weirdest play I've ever seen.
Exactly.
It runs ragged the over the story, but and
Exactly.
the libretto being strong as it is, the libretto needs the music just like the music needs the libretto. In that sense, it truly is musical theater. It's not just a
Well,
play with some music on top of it.
and one example which is very interesting there's a place which is quite devastating at the end of the scene, And then there's quite a bit of music, which is very slow. And at some point, it's simply these chords that sound and sound and sound. And when we were rehearsing this at first, the director was trying to come up with what the actors should be doing through this whole sequence. And he had a whole pantomime going on, all kinds of stuff. And I went to him and I said, please don't do anything.
Yeah.
Let it be and let this music just do what it's supposed to do for this, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, because that is the sequence of the story.
Exactly.
And trust the power of it.
Yeah. Together with the lighting as well, I should say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Marc Neikrug. This was a fabulous conversation. I really enjoyed talking with you. My only regret is I'm not in Santa Fe outside, enjoying a late afternoon drink while we have this conversation.
Thank you.